These Small Hours with Russell Cordell Staker. Hello, my friends. This is the Small Hours podcast. I am Russell Cordell Staker. It is the 17th November, 2021, and I'm coming to you from Austin, Texas. This is just a brief greeting as I commence now with segment 3 of the reading of my novella, In These Small Hours. Please enjoy. The night before, I got into a terrible fight with my wife. It snowed. It was a big snow, beautiful and quiet. I remembered how happy snow made me feel when I was a boy. I wanted to feel that way again, but with that snow, I felt very little. The job I was clinging to is about to be taken from me. I wearied my mind and sapped the best energy of my body as I calculated the hard consequences of the coming loss. I shouted in anger and spoke irrational words. My kids had seen me yell at their mom in a rage. She was equally hot, but I wore her down with my belligerent fusillade. I was terrified and insecure, and I was wrong. Rachel cried in a way that a woman does when she no longer recognizes the man she is married to. She asked me to leave the house and not come back until I had a plan. I drove into Salt Lake that morning with the leaden weight of our financial burden. My mind was a blank. All that I was and wanted to be rang like silly nonsense in my head. This included the sidecar novel I had been flailing for so many years to write. Who was I kidding? I wasn't a writer of any merit. The effort was just a selfish waste of time. I was a cipher about to be out of work again. A man with a wife he was in love with and 3 kids he adored, and no plan at Christmas. My cell phone vibrated. It was Dad. "Ransom, I think Polar Bear is dying. What's wrong with it?" I said in a flat tone. "Shitty transmission. I just had it in the shop. Hey, look, I got Bill off to his bus for work and the truck is running, but I'm afraid if I drive back up the hill, I won't get out later. I called my guy and he said he'll take a look at it this morning. I was wondering if you could follow me over there and then get me home. I'm probably going to need a ride back over to the shop later. I just hope it's all fixed before Bill's back on his bus." I sighed. God damn it, I thought. This is the last thing I needed. "Where are you at?" I could see Dad's white Dodge pickup as I crested the hill and pulled into the UTA drop-and-go lot. He was sitting inside watching the wipers eviscerate heavy snowflakes from the windshield, his hand on his chin. Discovering Dad in random places always brought a force of recognition for what a damn good man he was, even when he pissed me off. In a pulse of memory, I remembered a bitter night he'd shown up in Cedar and swapped out my piece of shit car with an older piece of shit car. I hated both, but I needed the wheels. Earlier that evening, I stood in an ATM machine off campus holding a receipt that read, "Insufficient funds." I was low. I called Dad, and he came. He drove from Salt Lake City without a second thought. He asked if I was hungry. I said no. He nodded, then reached into his pocket and handed me $50 I knew he didn't have. The look on his face reflected what we both understood and didn't have to say. He started toward the car and then stopped. I heard the crisp sound of a zipper in the raw night as Dad removed his Dodgers bomber jacket. "You have this," he said, tossing it to me. I caught it, feeling the heat of my father still inside of it. "Dodger blue looks better on you anyway, my boy," and he winked in his trademark Carl way. I wished I was wearing that coat now as I pulled up alongside his truck. An old woman wrapped in a long, anemic pink coat that looked like a sleeping bag crossed in front of my windshield and walked to the glass enclosure of the bus shelter and sat down. I lowered the window on the passenger side to talk to Dad. "You want me to follow you?" "Yeah, it's in Sandy." "Okay," I said. "I appreciate it, Ransom." I followed Dad. He sat heavy in his truck, curled over the steering wheel like a gambler holding cards tightly to his chest, head forward, no movement. I wondered what music he was listening to. My radio was switched off. On the tailgate, under a smudge of dirt and wet snow, was a faded blue logo with the letters AMA, situated underneath the torch of a blue flame flanked by a triple-tiered wingspan. I knew it well. We'd bought the sticker during a long road trip years before, which included a few stops to major league ballparks, but the ultimate destination had been the Academy of Model Aeronautics in Muncie, Indiana. Dad, always a card-carrying member of AMA, waltzed into its worldwide headquarters like a kid at Christmas. Bill and I remarked that he trembled just a little as he removed the membership card from his wallet and presented it to the pleasant woman at the front desk for admission into the Museum of Radio-Controlled Flying Machines. It was quite possibly the most perfect day of his life. I blinked. The dull gray of the morning was turning brighter. Its hard light revealed ugly stains in the snow. I reached for the synthetic squish of the sun visor above my head and pulled it down to shield my eyes from the glare of another plain morning. Somewhere in my belly I felt the cracks in the road as I rolled over them in pursuit of Dad's ailing truck. Each rubber zip and thud jogged the acid in my chest as I prepared myself for the inevitable phone call to my boss. I was going to be profligately late. I weighed the pros and cons of simply saying nothing at all, of walking into the office as if not a dicky bird had delayed me. Oh, the bitter joy of seeing the exasperation on the smug-bearded face of my corporate cunt of a middle manager. But there, too, was the terrible rub. What choice of impression was I giving him in return? Was I the sort of employee he could depend upon? Probably not. In spite of his petulant narcissism, I envied the game he naturally played, a game I was ill-suited for. I envied the promise of his upward mobility and security, even as I floundered. So much depended upon the job I wasn't going to keep. I drove on and sucked it up and dialed my boss. He was reasonable. I felt indignant for hating him as much as I did. Dad pulled into a small warehouse lot and waved me over. I came up alongside and he told me to park there. He was going to drive around back where the shop was. He'd be out in a few minutes. I nodded. I knew the man that worked on Polar Bear. He'd been good to Dad, but then again, Dad had been good to the man. That damn truck was more and more in the shop lately, and I wished I could do something about it. So much of the banal misery of living required the stroke of a check I couldn't write, and neither could Dad. Money was always wasted on the rich. Dad flung open the car door and backed into the passenger seat like a contented walrus. His energy preceded his girth as he sank down deep next to me, nearly out of breath. I noted a weariness his cheery face could not hide. He didn't look himself. Cold as hell out there. So what'd he say? He's going to call me in a couple hours. I nodded and started to drive. I admired Dad's cheerfulness, even in empty moments of inconvenience and minor adversity. He had the capacity to see things from a wide angle. It softened the agony of the financial burdens that usually beset him. I didn't want to admit the resentment that I held for Dad because of this. It was selfish, distorted, and wrong, but there it was nonetheless. Though the truck was his problem, I felt as if it was also mine. It had once again proven an intrusion, if at most it was only a reminder of how scant and illusory money had always been in our family. As a concept, scarcity, like a dank bath I chose to wallow in, perpetually symbolized a weakness I knew in myself, but projected upon my father as a gross and petty misjudgment of my own insular insecurity. I realized in that moment that for years I had been blaming him for it. A sudden, stifling misery choked out the wellspring of an otherwise natural and available kindness I provisioned unconditionally for this good man I was fashioned after, and pinched the words I molded in my head into sullen barbs meant only for myself, never for him. I had nothing good to say, no story to tell, no quarter to offer. Even then, I knew Dad required none of this, and in his ebullient, searching way, he simply went to a different place entirely, which only intensified my own sour bitch self-loathing. You should come over this weekend. Bill and I got a new plane to build. I could feel Dad looking at me as I held the road. Granville GB Model R Super Sportster. We're thinking of naming it Barry Gibb. He held the beat and waited for my comeback. I wasn't playing along. I stayed silent, and he let it go. He knew. We drove north for some minutes along Interstate 15 without saying a word. I knew it was impossible to go the distance in silence, but I also knew that Dad would have allowed my reasons for saying nothing without the slightest disappointment. He simply went along for the ride and looked out the window. I glanced over at him when he was looking away. His hands were cupped in his lap. They were my hands, too. They were busy hands somewhat diminutive for such a tall, broad man, a unique and identifiable attribute of the striker build. They were also articulate hands, the hands of an artist. Whenever I watched a Robert Redford film, I always noticed a bit of my father in the hands of the actor. There was a kindness and a grace in the way Redford used them as he navigated the characters he embodied and the emotions he thoughtfully brought to life. So much about a man can be identified by his hands. Of the many things my father could fashion and create with his hands, I thought then of the hamburgers he made for my brother Bill. For years, Bill worked in the men's department at Dillard's at the Fashion Place Mall in Murray. He liked having a homemade hamburger for his lunch which he would tote in a red igloo cooler on the UTA bus every day and heat up in the break room. Dad made the patties from scratch into a big batch every weekend. He carefully kneaded the ground lean sirloin into a delightfully seasoned 10-pound bowl of deliciousness, and then neatly formed individual hockey puck patties which he wrapped in wax paper and inserted into Ziploc baggies into the freezer. Early each morning, Dad would rise and put on coffee and remove one of those frozen patties and fry it up for Bill. Under the light of the stove top, it would sizzle while he prepared a fresh cut of lettuce and 2 slices of tomato and 3 perfect rings of white onion. Each of these would go in their own separate Ziploc baggie along with a bun sealed for its freshness. In small lidded containers, he deposited a healthy dollop of mustard and mayonnaise and ketchup and sealed them tight. Adjacent to these containers, he placed small traveler shakers of salt and pepper. And finally, the hot beef patty, still sizzling, would be wrapped in fresh wax paper and placed in a Rubbermaid container. All of this was then carefully situated in the red igloo cooler on the counter. He would then fill a tall stainless steel thermos with decaffeinated coffee and cream and screw the silver cap tight. After, Dad set a tidy breakfast at the small kitchen table before crossing over into the adjacent room to awaken Bill. The 2 men would sit at the table and share a meal and talk about the day ahead. Usually a convergence of unremarkable schedules and the anticipation of some small mutual pleasure to be had in the evening after the work was done. Together they would rise and walk out to the garage and get in the truck for the short ride to the UTA bus stop down the hill where Dad would see Bill off. "Sure, I'm proud of you, Bill," he would say. "I love you, Dad. Can't wait to eat my hamburger." Bill would reply with a smile as wide and magnificent as the Wasatch Mountain Range behind him. He would press his thick-framed glasses up the bridge of his nose with the heel of his thumb and then wrap his arms around Dad. They would embrace, and then he would go. Dad watched as Bill climbed aboard, holding the grip of the igloo cooler tightly in his hand, and stood there until the UTA bus had faded away and was gone. And he was always there when Bill returned. The routine never varied over the years. The seasons changed, but the clock unfolded in much the same manner, day in, day out. I observed this routine for myself on many occasions before I got married and on with my own life. There was something beautiful in the motion of it all, like an unvarnished poem, almost too simple to recite. I remember not long after I became a father for the first time sitting with Dad in his truck at the UTA lot awaiting Bill's arrival from the mall, and Dad expressing a nagging worry in his heart. "Ransom," he said, looking over at me, "I can't help but wonder what will become of Bill after I'm no longer here to care for him." His troubled face reddened. "Who will make the hamburgers he likes for his lunches?" I don't remember the answer I gave, but I felt the depth of the ache in his heart. I recognized for the first time in my life what the full measure of that ache actually meant. All of this was present as I looked at Dad's hands and simultaneously felt the tight-fisted grip of my own hands at 10 and 2 on the wheel. My fingertips were cracked, the skin crusted and torn in sharp, ugly fissures from a recurring eczema-like abhorrence, causing a brutal insult of pain like the jab of an ice pick at the tip of nearly every finger. I was convinced I was already dying of a cancer that hadn't fully revealed itself. I knew better than to persist in the malign self-pity I was willfully giving myself over to, but I didn't care anymore. "Dad, I don't know what I'm going to do," I said in a rough start. I felt a buzzing petulance in the form of a loaded electrical charge surge from my backbone. It was the same emotionally juvenile frustration I'd have emitted and been sent to my room for to discharge in a red-faced bellow when Mom had had enough of my bullshit. Inexplicably, I was ready to let Dad have all of it. He didn't speak. He continued to look out the window, cupping his hands in his lap. The pause was just long enough for the false charge in my veins to turn into a color I imagined as yellow-green. I felt a little sick to my stomach. "Nothing's panning out," I said. "I'm just tired of this shit. I'm worn out." "Is it work?" "It's everything." Dad looked down at his hands and then brought them up to his face to brush them along both sides of his whiskered jawline. The cheery facade he'd maintained was gone. "Well, Ransom, you're going to have to suck it up and figure it out. You're in the thick of it." "The fuck? Thick of what?" I was excessively sharp. "Manhood. Jesus. Maybe you need more of him in your life." "God damn it, Dad. I'm not going to have that conversation. Well, then what is it you want me to say, huh? This is life. You don't have a choice anymore. You're a grown man with a family. Cut the sullen attitude. You have to figure it out. What, like you? Working shitty sales jobs and bouncing from paycheck to paycheck, painting your ass red, buying bullshit model airplanes? You never did anything worth mentioning with your life. I'd gone too far, but the rotten inertia carried me further. You could have been a lot of things, Dad, but here we are with your piece of shit truck back in the shop. How long is it going to run this time before you call again to have me drag your ass to that fat old man in the wheelchair who takes your money and puts a Band-Aid on whatever it is he can't fix? He's milking you and you're letting him. I stopped short of saying something I couldn't bring myself to mention. Dad puckered and pinched his lips into a tight closed circle. I could see his jaw muscles bulge as he tightly clenched his teeth. He inhaled through his nostrils and opened his mouth to loudly exhale. In a firm but quiet voice, he said, "Spend less time pretending to be a writer, Ransom, and start focusing on the whole job. You think Rachel is going to put up with your sniveling intellectualism while she carries the financial load? Refresh your outlook, son. Be a man and keep your art on the side where it belongs. And if you want a piece of advice, at some point in your life, you have to move on from what you are not, or you'll fall off the edge of nothing into nothing." I didn't see that coming. It was a blindside that felt like a mortal wound, and it went to the center of my chest. Dad knew well enough that my writing, the very book I'd been struggling to teach myself to write, had been something I pursued in the cracks of my days after all other obligations were attended to. It was never the priority, never took precedence. But it was a nagging compulsion central to my evolving identity, which indirectly created complexities unforeseen and certainly never planned for, including 3 turbulent job changes with diminishing returns. For 6 long years, I stumbled in the dark and outright failed to produce anything at all, which was far worse than writing something that could be deemed a failure. There was no proof of the effort, which was a personal indictment and self-fulfilling damnation. In many respects, it had become a whispered joke under the table for some who wondered if they knew me at all. I wondered if I knew myself. Writing was the ultimate and last ambition of my heart. It, too, was my only hope. As time had gone on and I gave myself over to the notion of being a writer and the dead reckoning of his own craft, I realized that I may have been in over my head from the start. The disappointment of my best efforts embittered my spirit. I knew that Mom, with her own writing, had never fully arrived at the destination she aspired after, but she had made great progress where I had made none. Dad was right, of course, and he was living proof of the sacrifice he consistently made to provide for Bill and I over the years. He could have been a painter. Hell, he could have been 1,000 different artists, and in a sense he was, but never to the point of letting his art cloud the pragmatism life coldly demanded. He was always present with us. He never prevaricated from the path of his duty to Mom, to us, never shirked the priority of our lives over his own. He had raised me to be a man, and I was a man. He knew this. He also knew that I was doing all I could. But I had hurt him, and he, in a moment of truth, had picked up the very brick I needed him to hurl at me. In that heated moment rolling along I-15, I wanted to dissolve away into the smallest molecules of my own physical science and cease to feel this burden in my heart. I knew I was going to figure all of this out. To the bitter end, I would. But right then, I didn't want to be aggravated by the blinding limitations of my fenced-in viewpoint. "Dad, you don't even know what I'm writing." "I don't want to know," he said flatly. "I don't want to know anything about it." "I don't think you know. And until you do, it's not worth my time. It's certainly not worth yours. It's time to put it away and be a man." My eyes burned. He had silenced me. In my adult life, I had seen my dad as an equal, and he to me. We sometimes swerved in our thinking. He had his ideas and I had mine, but we always ended up back home. The swerve that morning felt disastrous, but the hard wiring in our shared grace was like coming off the gas and turning into the skid to regain course, composure, and control, which we did by instinct. I knew what he meant, and I knew he understood what I wasn't yet prepared to explain. We backed off. I saw Dad diminish even as I felt my own defensiveness and self-entitlement abate. The tension eased even as we sat hurting in bitter truths. I took exit 305 to 900 South and drove up the slope to the house. As I pulled into the inclined driveway and observed the old backboard goal above the garage, dirty white and brown and missing its lattice net, Dad put his hand on my thigh and squeezed. His grip was strong and vital. It was a healing touch as real as anything worth feeling, a tangible force of presence I didn't want to be released from. He lowered his head and looked at his feet on the floorboard. "On the morning your mom died, I got up earlier than I usually did. I knew she was about to go, even though the doctor said she was rallying. It wasn't any exceptional insight on my part, but I knew. I went downstairs and stepped out onto the back porch to have one of those big cries. Where you can't breathe, and instead what comes up is a shuddering burst, an ardor too great to explain. I was racked, just so fucking lost. Dad's voice cracked, and he took a moment to regain his composure. I was also mad as hell. You boys were little, and I had a shit job, and suddenly I had to face all of life without the only woman that mattered to me. I had to make some hard choices in order to survive. I was done praying. Mom was going, and God had nothing to do with it. And I decided I was going to give up painting altogether. It felt trite, hollow, self-serving. I wasn't even French. I buckled to my knees and sobbed. I remember grabbing hold of the deck railing and putting my cheekbones between two of the wooden slats just to keep myself from falling over flat onto my wet face in the garden. There below in the flower bed was a wild patch of radiant blue cornflowers, Evelyn's favorite. I remembered when she'd painted them in the spring, or planted them in the spring after we moved into the house. She told me they were known as bachelor buttons because in old Europe, single men would place them in the buttonhole of their dress coats to signify availability as courting gentlemen in search of new ladies. It was a flower that lasted long enough to catch the eye of a female while all the others faded. I stopped crying and started to laugh. Even as your mom was clinging to the last vestige of her own life, she was having her way with me. I had no intention of ever putting a blue cornflower in the buttonhole of my jacket because those flowers would always be just for your mom. And, for the most part, I never did. Dad looked up and I met his gaze. Son, this life is a son of a bitch. I know you're digging deep. And I know how much it hurts to be a man sometimes. I know. I think about you and I think about Bill every day. I wish I could do more for the both of you. Right now, your brother is on his feet in a suit giving service at a department store with everything he's got. Even when no one is around, he is giving it his all. I know you do the same, and I'm damn proud of you both for being exactly who you are. And you know what? I shook my head. You're right. I could have been somebody else in this life, but I decided to be a dad, and that, he held up his index finger in a point-fisted gesture, is where I paint. I'm still blending a lot of color and struggling to find the right light for all the gray and shade of living, and the hardest part of being a dad is knowing where to delicately place my own silhouette into the backdrop of your lives. I'm not sure I'll ever get that right, but I am trying. Maybe that's why I started to build airplanes with you boys. It reminds me that living is mostly not art. It's just living. And I live for fly days with my sons, but only after the hours we spent together in the garage getting ready for them. We looked at each other and nodded. I'm sorry, Dad. I am too. We reached across the console and embraced. Get right with the shit that needs to be gotten right first, and the rest will come to you, my boy. Even the things you can't yet imagine will come. There are words out there you just haven't learned yet, but they're already yours. You'll see. Dad ran his tongue under his front lip along the ridge of his teeth, and then held it there. He was fighting tears. As Dad climbed out of the truck, he turned back and said, I'm driving a piece of shit truck because you didn't keep your batting average up. Just remember that, Ransom. You could have been an L.A. Dodger, and I would have been driving a brand new, more nimble version of Polar Bear. A pox on you. You're a real piece of work, Dad. You know that? Always, he said, and winked. I drove away. As I got to the bottom of the hill and turned toward the heart of Salt Lake City, I dialed up Van Morrison and let the song, And It Stoned Me, take me to church. Dad was always the man with the great big gallon jar. Winter passed. I lost my job and spent the following spring and terribly long summer doing what I could. On the one hand, being with the kids was a godsend, but on the other, the means and necessity of making ends meet was increasingly exhausting. Money was miserably tight, and my wife was worn down by the corporate burden she brilliantly bore just to keep us afloat. Our relationship was a strained discourse of probabilities and dimming hopes. We lived like divers swimming under a black volume of mounting debt, only coming up to the surface at short intervals for desperate gasps of heavily dank air. We were surviving, and we did what we could for each other, but the means which came belonged to a machine hardly seen, only heard, like a foreign craft just beyond the atmosphere, whirring drone-like between the chirping of birds. This was the 21st century of the only American dream we knew, and one I no longer believed in. I sent out countless resumes and attended worthless job fairs and usually fought with clueless recruiters, insensately pandering the promise of jobs they neither articulated nor much understood. The corporate hiring process was nothing more than a drubbing, a maddening joke, and an utter waste of time. I found myself evolving into a role of life I couldn't have imagined when I was a younger man, rising rod-like through college and graduate school in the virile delirium of the wettest dreams of his strident idealism. The very notion of my former education now felt entirely superfluous and wholly out of sync with a world that could have cared less about what I thought I knew or how I had come by any such knowledge. I told myself not to quit, that the pain didn't matter, and that I just had to keep trying, which I did. I wasn't sure how, but I knew I would find my way, eventually. And, in the small hours, I kept writing. Late one night, I had a peculiar dream. Earlier in the evening, Rachel and I sipped from a fine bottle of tequila and got friendly with each other. We laughed a lot and then made love. And after, I fell asleep holding my wife. I awakened to the sound of a whistle. Its register is a distinctive beacon I've known all my life, a cheer-up Dad makes in a crowded place when Bill and I have strayed to let us know where he is in the fray. We simply know that to hear the whistle is to come quickly to Dad. Reacting by instinct to its sound, I rise from bed and move quickly to the open window of my room and look out into the murk of night, but see nothing. I am agitated, assuming Dad must be somewhere along the other side of our neighbor's fence in the yard below. This makes little sense to me. I urgently turn and run out of the room to the hallway and down the stairs and on through the dark house to get out to him. Once in the yard, I make for the fence and lunge and then climb to the top, surprised by how fortress-like it seems. I scale it nonetheless and quickly. At the top, I press my palms onto the rough-hewn wooden slats and call out, "Dad?" For a moment, there is no sound, and then below me, I hear Dad whistle once again and see him in the pale twilight at the far corner of the fence. He is visibly disoriented and afraid. I jump and close the gap between us to wrap him up in my arms. I hold him for a moment and then lean back a bit and cup his head in my hands and feel the sweaty damp of his hair. He is attempting to say something to me, but no words come. His blue eyes are analog noise. Somehow I understand that what he is unable to say, and I too struggle for the words. All that remains is shadow and a profound sense of loss. I awaken with a start and sit up in bed and weep. I wanted to call Dad to tell him about the dream, but what would I say? I didn't know. And so I never mentioned it. I just kept it to myself, unsure of why it remained with me when so many other dreams so quickly faded away. Several weeks passed. On Saturday, the 5th of October, 2015, I was standing at the side of the pitch watching my daughter Lily take a shot on goal in a soccer game when my cell phone vibrated in my back pocket. "Hey, Dad. Bill's sick." "What?" "He's real sick. I'm taking him to University Hospital right now." "What?" "It's not good." Dad's voice hitched. There was a slight pause as he attempted to go on, but didn't. He couldn't speak. The chasm in that beat was more than enough to tell me everything I needed to know. My own wall of emotion stored as if behind a heavy dike along the wall of a deep green volume of fear cracked. I found it hard to catch my breath. "I'm on my way right now." When I told Rachel the news, her face registered what I was feeling inside. I realized then that silently, and for years, all of us had been preparing for this. I remember how beautiful that bright morning in Salt Lake City was, how pristine and pure. I drove in a trance. As I ascended the hill to the University of Utah Medical Center, I felt as if I was just a passenger on some self-propelled mechanical tour of mortality, transported forward inside a bubble of glass toward an experience I had no control over. I knew we were going to lose Bill. I steeled myself. Entering the hospital, I was as confused as I was lost. A hospital is a curious place, an atmosphere more than a destination. A portal for passage through condensed time, fraught usually with the experience upon which banal life suddenly finds itself subjected to acute drama and terrible uncertainty. It isn't that entering a hospital guarantees a tussle with mortality, but the rawness and propinquity of this awareness is there nonetheless, and suddenly the idea of time takes on a heightened consciousness of its infinitesimal duration. I felt an acute sense of probability and of hazard, of beginnings and endings, and of human beings being their best and worst all within the space of this labyrinth of a structure. A portal to enter and, all at once, possibly, a terminal to slip away from. I have no memory of how I found Dad. He was sitting alone in a broad room, looking ashen and anxious, cupping his hands oddly just out in front of his belly, the fingers of his left hand wrapped around his right thumb. I got a glimpse of him as a little boy. He was afraid. I hastened forward and reached down for him. He turned and looked up at me, rising awkwardly into my arms, and nearly fell over in the process, but I steadied him. The disorientation in his eyes was both startling and familiar, as I immediately remembered how Dad looked when I discovered him in my dream just a few weeks before. Even now, I won't say this was more than a passing coincidence, but the dream had attuned my sense to a heavier mortal complexity as it began to draw itself out right there before me. I remembered the sound of Dad's whistle and held him tight just as he held tightly to me. As it was, Bill had come home the previous evening from Dillard's not feeling well. He was feverish, and Dad got him into bed to rest. The fever persisted into the early hours of the morning, and Bill's breathing suddenly became labored. Dad was distraught as he repeated, "I should have brought him in last night." But Dad had taken excellent care of Bill, as he always had. Some things run a course all their own and are entirely beyond control. What was shocking was how rapidly Bill deteriorated. By the time of my arrival at the hospital, he was already being put on a respirator for acute pneumonia, and shortly thereafter went into cardiac arrest. The confluent force of nature, swelling in its current, hissed until it crashed on the rocky shore of our lives and left us adrift in the brackish gray of its undertow. The words and explanations that followed from a series of medical professionals that nurtured us through and out from under a wash of details which followed are hard to remember. And in looking back, those words aren't freighted in the sorts of narrative worth the telling. What resounded was the rawness of a new reality that Dad and I surmised might one day present itself to us, and to which it suddenly had. Bill passed. The attending physician was most kind as he gently spoke to Dad and to me about what transpired. I could see in his face that he had done all he could. Just before the doctor turned to go, he placed his hands on Dad's shoulders and lowered his head. His touch was substantial, a sturdy edge of rock above a silent, moving sea. Later, as we walked together out to Dad's truck, I had to hold on to him. He was listing under the weight of that sea. Death is a shock to the living. The body numbs itself against an elusive pain, even as it heightens a power of observation which locks certain impressions into a lifetime of memory. I remembered the feeling I had when Mom died. It was a terrible ache of nothingness, an awareness that no matter how hard I screamed, the sound could not penetrate the silence which stilled her beautiful voice. I was 9, Bill was 6. He often asked me about it and how it made me feel. His memory was far simpler and singular. His was a more pure memory. He had no recollection of her dying, but he remembered taking refuge from her absence in me. Over time, I began to realize that what he retained, its impression on him, was far more meaningful and vivid than even my own direct memory of the event, and that somehow, because of it, I would eventually find myself taking refuge in him. His memory was one of comfort, of the comfort he felt with me and with Dad. "Sure was cozy in your bed," he would say, broadly smiling, as he reflected on all those nights shortly after the funeral when we'd snuggle together in bed so that I could tell him a pirate story, which was usually an ongoing and flimsy rendition of something inspired by Robert Louis Stevenson's Treasure Island. And then, reverently, he would say, "Dad was always there, wasn't he, Ransom?" "Yeah," I'd say, "he was." The morning after Bill died, I stood outside Smith's grocery and stared at a large cardboard crate filled with bright orange pumpkins. The shock of color stunned me. I remained there and looked at the pumpkins for a very long time. I forgot why I had come to Smith's. I didn't need anything. The autumnal charm of October was in full. The sun was bright and the morning was warm. I listened to the sounds of people and grocery carts on the pavement. I paid attention to their words. As I listened, I registered the language. It was full of declarative emphasis of simple and unimportant things, lively and clear. The sounds of the voices blended with the brilliance of color, and I whispered a hard truth to myself. I don't remember my exact words, but my expressed consideration was a hard reckoning of life with death, and that Bill, like Mom, now understood the measurement of both. As much as I wanted to tell Bill about the pumpkins, I knew I couldn't. He simply wasn't there anymore. I would never hear his voice again, not the way I was hearing ordinary voices in front of Smith's. Later that afternoon, I went up to the house to see Dad. He was in the garage working on a plane as I got out of the car. He looked up and smiled at me, but I could see he hadn't slept. The light was low in his eyes. "There's my boy," he said. "Hey, Dad." I walked over to him and put my hands on his back as he sat hunched over handling balsa slats for a wing he was building. My touch seemed to trigger a small shake in his hands. He lifted a slat and fit it neatly into a smooth groove and blew the loose dust and shavings clean. I wanted to say something. I knew he did too, but neither one of us spoke, and I came around the side of him and sat on a stool to watch him work. The garage was very quiet, save for the sounds of finches and sparrows in the yard and an occasional passing car and Dad's fingers brushing against bits of wood. Bill's absence was palpable and as obvious as the stilled stereo. I wanted to hear Don't Worry Baby by the Beach Boys. I looked up at Dad's painting on the wall and thought of the sound of the Mediterranean Sea and of the boat and of the ghost in Marseille. That odd and beautiful disheveled man standing at the edge of the shore seemed to be looking right at me, and for some reason I wanted to take refuge beyond the frame of Dad's viewpoint as it focused itself on the lifeless, sun-saturated old boat laying on its side. Maybe it was the moment itself, or possibly I was in need of some deeper meaning that only my imagination could define or suggest, but I thought of a ghost of my own, one I hadn't thought about in a very long time. As I considered it, the discovery of my ghost was on a sharp, clear morning in Belgium, not long after I had left home in 1993, was something I had always wanted to tell Dad about, but had never gotten around to doing so, and I couldn't explain why. I hesitated, wondering if now was the right moment, but I was unsure of my experience and its minor observation. It was possible the lingering impression of my own ghost would somehow not sync with the similarity of Dad's. Or that maybe if I told Dad about my ghost, I'd be trying too hard to make something out of nothing at such an empty time. And so I let it be. Is this the GB? Yeah, Dad said. Bill was excited about this one. I put my arm around Dad and leaned into him. There would be no catharsis here, no relief from this ticking clock of our history and our passage through it. To mark this time was to be fully aware of it. Bill had been a force of life and light. His passing only outlined the stark brilliance of the light death had taken from us. Bill was only a few short miles away, lying cold in a refrigerated locker. Neither one of us dared speak of this reality. For a time we sat together in the garage until the light changed. With the coming of the end of that day, the shock of the day before was replaced with a grinding misery of all the days to be gotten through, those interminable days ahead. The bitterness was hard, an aggravation of sorrow that was particularly acute for Dad. His grief was incalculable. My grief was confused with worry, which treaded itself upon the insult of routines and obligations and debts still requiring attention, none of which offered any quarter to the edge of this hard time. My sorrow was spilling over into an acid of incomprehensible anger towards God, a loathing I identified not in some ethereal form, but as a direct attribution of unnecessary myth, and the requisite demands it now made upon my spirit. I repressed this sharp nothingness into a sour ache as I sat stifled, watching Dad make little progress with the wing of his plane. We were just inching forward through the torpor of another one of those interminable hours. Let's get you inside, Dad. You look tired. Dad gently released the bits of wood he was holding in his hands and slowly slid back from his makeshift bench and rose. He no longer stood as tall as I remembered him to stand. He hunched noticeably under the pull of his own weight, his shoulders rounding forward toward the center of some invisible anchor beneath his feet. He smiled at me and winked, but I knew the cost of that effort, and I admired him for it. I got him situated on the couch and turned on Game 4 of the World Series being played at Busch Stadium between the Cardinals and the Sox. It was the bottom of the 5th inning. At first, we just watched and listened to the sound of the game, and then slowly we began to talk baseball, just like we always had. Dad said he was glad the Cards were up 2-1 compared with the sweep of 04. Even though we'd both been for the Sox back in that series and were for the Sox in this one, Dad never liked a lopsided fall classic. His feeling was every pennant title and series always go at least 6 games, regardless of who you were pulling for. I agreed. That night, Boston won and tied it all up 2-2. The quality in Dad's voice was revived when he said, "Well, now we've got a series." With the game over, the heaviness returned. I wished I hadn't been so quick to turn the television off. I knew that Dad was drifting again into the flow of that great unknown, and so was I. "I can stay if you'd like," I said. Dad shook his head and looked down at his hands. "My dad got a job in a lumber yard when he was about 16, said Dad. "That was in 1929, and only a few weeks short of the market crash. His father would lose the dry farm he'd bought the decade before, and the family was already in dire straits. I don't know that Dad was aware of how bad things were going to get for him and the family at that particular moment. He told me as much, but in reflecting on his telling of this moment in his history, I've often found myself narrating into its gaps. And every time I do, I hear his voice and learn something new about it. It was the end of July, and Dad was in an old Model 8 truck with his buddy Rowberry, who helped him get the job. They'd gone out early that morning to Ryrie to pick up a load of lumber from a man who was selling scrap. By the time they got back to Idaho Falls, it was verging upon noon. He said the man at the farm was a real talker, and his wife had also made them a big breakfast, which they were obliged to eat. But it also put them way behind, and Dad was worried that Mr. Hancock was going to fire him. The truck had also broken down along the way, and he and Rowberry had to piss on the manifold and block to cool it down enough to get the engine restarted. They limped into town and were just about to the yard when several neighbor boys came running up to the truck, red-faced and agitated. They were yelling. Dad said he couldn't make out what they were saying, and he told Rowberry to slow down. The boy at the head of the pack caught up to the truck. His name was Thomas, a buddy of Dad's little brother, Spencer. Dad said Tom looked right at him with eyes like white fire and screamed with all he had, veins bulging in his neck, "Scud's dead! Scud's dead! Scud's dead!" Dad jumped up out of the truck and ran for the house. Scud was Spencer's nickname. When he got home and entered the kitchen, his 12-year-old brother was lying wet and cold on the table. The whole family and half the street was crowded into the house. Two of the fathers at the end of South Boulevard had been the ones to fish Spencer out of the upper Snake River, where he and his buddies had been out swimming that morning. Scud could swim, but he most likely got caught in an undertow. They found his body about 100 yards further on from the inlet where the boys had been jumping in. "My God," I whispered. Not long before our dad died, I washed his hair in a red rubber basin as he lay in a hospice bed at the house. He asked me if I thought he was going to die, and I told him yes, he was. He looked up at me as I held his damp head in a soft hand towel and smiled. His face, misshapen by the aftermath of the stroke, was still beautiful and full of light. I knew he was frightened. His brightness was heavy. Was this the moment, I thought, the plunge into a sequence of sorrows, of truths, and possibly an opening for a family secret? No. It was merely a reminder of a story I had heard a time or two before, but one I had never forgotten. Scud's story was as much a part of my sense of being and self as any other portion of my own searching heart. It was a story of life and death, and it was too personal to misplace in my own heart. Though I had not heard Dad speak of it for years, at the mere mention of his little brother's name, I remembered the first time I'd heard him tell it. Could see myself again in the front room of Mom and Dad's house where I'd grown up on South Boulevard and been told that story for the first time. It never left me. It was natural to realize this was uppermost on Dad's mind, but he didn't tell the story, not the way I'd heard it before. What he told me was different. There was something deeper underneath his simple words, and most of what he had to say he actually didn't say at all. It was all in the way he said the name of his brother. But rather than call him by his name, Spencer, which he always had, this time he called him by the name his friends had given him, Scud. And all I remember him really saying was this: "I wish I'd been in the water with Scud." A silence took hold of the room after he said that. He said nothing further. It wasn't until the following afternoon that Dad passed away. I wasn't in the room with him when he went. My sister and mother were there. I'd gone out to put gas in the car just down the road after having taken a drive to get some air and a little something to eat. That's when he died. As I stepped through the front porch, I could see the reddened faces of my sister and mother, and I knew Dad was gone. I've never begun to understand death. It's one of those common elements that we living have to put up with and spend the majority of our lives being quietly aware of without ever really having much say in the matter. What I detest about the fact of death is what must be the one universal truth about it. It is final. There's no sound, and no sound ever emanates from the person it is finally and imperturbably silenced once and for all. I went to take a look at Dad. I entered the room alone and walked softly to the side of the bed where the body of my father lay very still. His face still had enough color to give the impression that he was possibly only having a little nap, but it was the void of any sound that told me otherwise. I ran my right hand along the length of his covered legs and up his torso to each of his arms, and then I took both of my hands and cupped his face and kissed his forehead. I told him, "You were a good dad," and then turned and left the room. In the years since Dad's death, I've begun to add to the story of Scud. Not because I have any sense that I should, but only out of a feeling of possibly piecing together something from my wonderment about where Dad might be, and what it is he now sees, and also what he understood and kept to himself before he left. I've never come to any final conclusion save for this. I believe he wanted to be in the water with his brother, if only somehow to let Scud know he was there right at the end. When you and Bill were little boys, your mom and I made a trip to the Oregon coast. One afternoon we walked out into the surf ahead of a dark storm that was building in the near distance. The air was rough, and it was quickly becoming too cold to find much enjoyment in the beauty of the setting. When I told you boys it was time to go, that we needed to get back in the car, Bill threw a hell of a fit and went running off. He didn't get more than 50 yards near a rocky embankment, which dropped about 6 feet into a violent deep eddy of the Pacific, but I remember having a distinct premonition that if I didn't get to him quickly, I'd lose him forever. I yelled at you, Ransom, to grab your brother. You were throwing rocks in the water. You turned and ran and got to Bill just before I did. Your mother wasn't far behind. Bill was furious, but he was safe. Except that my imagination seared into memory the horror of what might have been. It was a helpless, sick feeling of watching Bill go over that edge and down beyond my reach into the dark where I'd never be able to find him. Dad got quiet for several seconds. I saw pain register in the expression of his face as he chewed on his lower lip. I wasn't there in the room when Bill passed. Dad inhaled sharply. I should have been there. Dad, I started. I wasn't with him. Bill's gone over that edge, and he's beyond my reach now. Dad blanched. I can't find him. We laid Bill to rest. The beauty of fall turned bitter, and an early winter came. For a time, Dad and I drifted into our own corners of coping. I wish I could say that I was more present for Dad, but I wasn't. In those early weeks, I decided it was best I let Dad have his space, but I probably needed my own as well. I regret this. Rachel tethered Dad and I together during that awful time, and I'm grateful she did. She also kicked me in the ass, told me I needed to man up and be more physically present with Dad. She said, the fog isn't going to lift on its own. You got to cut through it. And more than that, you've got to shine a big light for your dad so he can as well. She was right. And so I got in the car and drove up to the house to see Dad right at the end of that year. When I got there, the front lights were on, but it wasn't the same. I knocked and then entered. The air inside was stale. Dad, I called out as I walked into the kitchen. No answer. There on the table was a big bowl of yellowed milk with saturated pieces of sunk bread and a few ragged chunks of torn yellow cheese sloppily plopped into a bowl. I remember Dad eating this makeshift gruel on many occasions after Mom died. Dried milk and crusted circles dotted the table. On the floor next to the table was the kit box for the Granville GB Model R and 2 other planes I didn't recognize. No progress appeared to have been made with any of them. I should have been there to help Dad build. I heard him shuffling about in the basement with some tools. He came up the steps and walked through the door and into the kitchen. To my surprise, he was neatly dressed and bright of face. His wispy hair was combed back, and his round red cheeks were hot with life. I saw a bit of Bill in Dad. Well, he said, opening his arms up wide as if to gesture some grand announcement, today is the last day of my second and far shorter career in Yellow Pages. I am officially a dinosaur now. 10 years previously, Dad had been forced out of what had once been Mountain Bell Yellow Pages when the company was purchased and later gutted by a corporate investment conglomerate only interested in milking what was left of a dying cash cow, and then turning around to run its debt so high that the company was forced to fold. For a few years, Dad subsisted on his accelerated retirement and the false promise of a pension and health care he thought was his for life. When the Yellow Pages, then called Dex, folded, he lost it all, and the Great Recession gutted the rest. For a few years, Dad hitched his wagon to some regional third-rate Yellow Page company, running a book a fraction of the size he'd spent his career selling advertising for. But technology and the world in general had long passed that business and my dad by. Goddamn Google, he grunted. No one uses a phone book anymore except old ladies with no money. I've been selling bound toilet paper, and for nothing. A pirate's life for me, oh hi diddly dee. I'm sorry, I said. I put my arms around him and gave him a hug. I knew how brutal this was, how devastating its implications. Dad's life force was diminished. He shook in my arms. Ransom, he said, I don't think I can make it. His voice was thin and ancient. No, Dad, I said, you're going to make it. You're not out of this fight. Not yet. Thank you for being with me here in these small hours.